I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Welcome back to the show. Thank you for tuning in. That is Matt behind the camera. I'm Ben. We've got Agent Scully in the background here somewhere in the darkness, and you may also be able to discern a special guest of ours, our coworker Dylan, who's hanging out with us today. So here's the background. It's 2015. In September of this year, it will be 70 years, 7 decades since the human race was in a global conflict. So go team, yay us. That's not to say that the world is perfect. Humanity remains divided. We're still in a situation where one person's terrorist is seen as someone's freedom fighter, one person's settler, someone else's invader, kind of like when Hurricane Katrina hit and the news made some pretty sketchy decisions about who was a forager versus who was a looter. Additionally, the situation is worse in that wildlife is going extinct at an astonishing and horrifying rate. There are more slaves now than at any other time in recorded history, but, and this could either be inspiring or tragic, this is also, right now, when you're watching this video, the age in which we live, this is the most peaceful time in human history, as far as we know. And you can look at the work of Steven Pinker for more information on that. I think our buddies Josh and Chuck also have a podcast on it. And this prompted Matt and I to ask one very important question. How long will this last? Is there another world war on the way? And if so, how would it happen? When? Here are 3 flashpoints that could be the area where a regional conflict expands across the globe. Number 1, Russia versus NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's no secret that Russia and its sphere of influence have been threatened by NATO encroachment. At least that's how Moscow sees it. And with the recent annexation of Crimea, which interestingly enough belonged to Russia until 1954 when Stalin gave it to Ukraine, that annexation has become a major flashpoint in international affairs, in global relations, and has highly increased the possibility of war. And when we say NATO, although that does mean a bunch of different countries poking at the sleeping bear of Russia, what we're really talking about, the primary rival, as Russia sees it, is the USA, the United States, Uncle Sam, right? And it's absolutely safe to say that neither country really wants a war, because things could escalate in a very serious and very dangerous fashion very quickly. We're talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about what happens if a preemptive strike occurs. This is the point where in these conversations, Matt and I will usually mention to each other Russia's counterattack program, the so-called dead hand system, which just releases all of the nukes. That's some end of the world stuff, literally. Number 2, China versus Japan versus the US, possible other countries in the region. This is one of the things that you'll hear pundits in the West talk about nearly continually. They'll say, well, China is emerging as a superpower, as an economic threat. The US has to pivot toward Asia to do something to maintain its hegemony in the area. And that's what China is attempting to establish, a regional hegemony. Their biggest conflicts right now are concerning the rights of sea, of naval territory. And China is working to create a blue water navy, a navy that could, like the US Navy, go around the world. It's a difficult proposition, but the benefits of having this kind of force more than outweigh the risk by far. There's another factor here that people may not often talk about in the mainstream Western media, which is that Chinese citizens and Chinese officials in the PRC, in the military, believe that a war with the US may be inevitable at some point in the future, because the US is seen as limiting China's ability to grow and to expand as a regional and a global power. You'll hear sometimes officials in the military talking about the so-called peace disease, meaning that they haven't actually served in a war. And while many Chinese citizens believe that this may be a necessary war in the future, which is different from being excited or wanting it to happen, it is also true that many Chinese citizens believe the war between the US and China would ultimately result in a Chinese victory. And that's not an unreasonable assumption, at least not as unreasonable as it would have been several years or decades ago, because China has been growing into its own. It's establishing bilateral relationships with other countries that are often antagonistic to the US. It is also expanding its investment in other countries, including the African continent, to control more resources, which we'll get to in a second. And perhaps most importantly, it's investing a great amount of time and money into what's called asymmetrical warfare, asymmetrical measures. So instead of building a multi-million-dollar carrier ship, which they are also doing, why not just build missiles that can destroy one, or a sub that can sneak up and destroy one? However, there are a lot of reasons that China and the US would not go to war, at least not for a while, not to a big global war, maybe just some proxy stuff out in Eurasia. And the reasons are not necessarily friendly reasons. One, China has some crippling domestic problems. The environmental situation is rapidly deteriorating. Check out how many rivers have just disappeared recently in that country, which is not to say that the US is in perfect shape itself either. The US military has been stretched thin through Afghanistan, through Iraq, and that's not even counting the continuing operations around the globe. And of course, and maybe this is one of the biggest things, the economic intertwining of China and the US. It's been compared before to a standoff, you know, where both people have a gun pointed at the other one's head. It's been compared to being attached at the hip. But whatever comparison you want to use, the fact of the matter is that this greatly increases the cost of these countries waging war on each other, not the least because they are dependent upon one another for several types of goods that they would need in a war. 3, and you knew this was coming, the Middle East, for various reasons. Saudi Arabia and the US and Israel versus Iran, the Islamic State versus everybody, including the people who are bankrolling them. This situation has long been at the forefront of various pundits and military officials' minds. It seems like the Middle East is always on a slow boil that at any moment could escalate into a war involving all of the powers of the earth. This so far hasn't happened, thankfully, but if it does, it would almost certainly draw in the proxies of the great powers around there. So not just Iran's Hezbollah or the US MEK, but it would draw in the powers associated with that. And we've seen this before with Russian support of Syria ongoing, right? Although that's primarily to save their port in the country. We've also seen, you know, US support with Saudi Arabia, US support with Israel. There are more than just the local countries active in here, and that's what makes this situation so dangerous. So what do these 3 possible origin points of World War III all have in common? They have a couple of things. One, these wars would be fought on new frontiers. Make no mistake, the digital world, the online world itself, will be an entirely new front. Space will also be a new front. Remember when China shot that satellite out of the sky? It wasn't their way of taking out the trash. And by the way, what is the X-37B doing up there, unmanned and orbiting space on secret missions? Another commonality would be resource wars. Everything from water to petrol to rare earth minerals could easily trigger regional conflicts that later spark across the world. Trade connections. We've already talked about this with China and the US, but it applies to every country now because every country is so much more connected than it has ever been in the past. Yes, even North Korea is more connected than it's ever been in the past. And this is where we see the economic aspects of war, which, if we're being honest, were always there and were the primary factor for a lot of conflict in history. But now we'll see, now we can see sanctions more and more effectively as a weapon. 4, nuclear weapons. Some of the same technology that ended World War II could literally end civilization as we know it. You've probably heard of the theory of nuclear deterrence, which is that if one country has nuclear weapons and another country has nuclear weapons, they're just sort of insurance and no one will actually fire them. However, in a conflict where a nuclear weapon is deployed by one side, of course, other sides are going to do it. And this threat is so dangerous, so tremendous, that other countries would launch preemptive attacks against one another to deny the chance to use nuclear weapons. Now, whatever you think about the theory of nuclear deterrence, the truth is that it primarily only applies to states, to world countries. So what happens when a non-state actor, like a terrorist group, the Islamic State, another, a separatist group, what happens when they get a hold of a nuke, right? Something post-Soviet, maybe something from Pakistan. What happens when they launch that? And this is all just speculation. Thank you for watching. We want to know what you think. Would a world war happen? Is it going to happen in our lifetimes? If so, why, how, when? If not, then why? We hope you'll check out our audio podcast for more information later this week. Thanks so much for watching. As always, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Twitter, and if you want to write to us directly, we are conspiracy@howstuffworks.com.